introduction. He's the author of very many books, he's the winner of very many prizes, and you hear him particularly and very effectively on independent radio and on RTE radio and other radio, not BBC, for reasons he may yet explain. But broadly speaking, he does bring an enormous amount of news and opinion, and I'm sure he has found this to be so, to a very wide public through the cell phone, the mobile phone, and wherever he is, his LinkedIn is on air within minutes. That's one of the big changes, and it's one of the issues, indeed, the technology and how the whole reporting of current affairs and of war reporting has changed, which is partly where I want to begin tonight, Robert. May I also say before we begin that Jane did not suggest any dress code tonight for both of us, as you know.
But I did say to the driver was bringing me in, and I bet that John will wear a linen suit.
Well, anyway, there we go. When you began your career, Robert, there was no 24-hour news, no live television reporting by satellite from the front, no camera phones, no internet. How has, and that's quite recently, really, they've all come along in about 20 years. If you think of the Falklands War and how that was reported, and you did report it, the change has been absolutely phenomenal, and the impact on the war, and the course of the war, and the politicians' options, all changed, and the soldiers' options. So what impact has it had on all of that?
Oh, well, I think the most serious and gravest impact is that it's produced 24-hour news. And I can take you straight to the scene of this, Baghdad, the BBC roof with the 2 palm trees in the background, where the reporter cannot go out and report, cannot go out and talk to ordinary Iraqis. Anyway, as it got more dangerous, he had to go out with 6 armed men, like a kind of phalanx of Roman Praetorian Guard. And it wasn't the time to do any reporting. So what would happen is that, well, you're on the 9 o'clock news, you're on the 1:10, and then you're on the BBC Radio 4, then you're on Radio World Service, and then Television World Service. So the poor guy stands there hour after hour in the sun. And he keeps being given bits of paper, which is the Reuters wire from Baghdad, which goes to London and comes back to the BBC, and then it's handed to the same guy on the roof. He's only 200 metres from the Reuters office. And then BBC will say, well, what do you hear about the bomb? So, well, what we're hearing here is, because the BBC have just read him in the earpiece, what they've seen on Reuters from Baghdad. And in effect, what you've got is a totally false, it's a kind of, it's a Disney World. You can't go out on the streets if you're on 24-hour radio or 24-hour television. You can't do any reporting. And you rely on your colleagues on the news agencies who are going to put out, of course, a very bland version of events that doesn't upset anyone and doesn't make anyone write in and say that it's too controversial. So you constantly, I use the phrase, you blandize your coverage. And you're not getting live coverage, you're getting someone's reading out the news agency wire, which they've heard from London or Washington or New York or wherever their head offices are. That's a very difficult situation because it's no longer journalism, it's just being an echo chamber to what's being put out on the wire. From my point of view, it hasn't changed that much because I refuse to use the internet or email or Twitters and Twatters and SMSs and so on. I do sometimes get SMS messages and I know how to reply to them, but I don't. What I find is that it gives newspaper reporters an opportunity to go out in the streets and do the real story. In other words, we can find out what's actually happening and talk to people who are there. I'm not talking just about bombs and press conferences and everything else. And the next day, what's interesting is that the newspaper reporters, not just the Independent, but the Guardian and anybody else who has who's working for a newspaper, their theme and what they find out suddenly comes back onto the television screen where they can't do any serious reporting. So it kind of bounces back. But it's of no use in the end because most people want to watch television, they want to pick it up live. And the real danger in this, well, there are 2 dangers. First of all, is that television will not show you what war is like. It will not show you what we see. It will give you, again, a bland, a sort of bloodless sandbox in which old fossil generals will sit in studios in London and move tanks around, and then you'll have a few shots. You might see a dead body if an Iraqi has been obliging enough to die, without being badly, burned or whatever by the side of the road. But the body is blown to pieces, or the dogs running off with bits of children's bodies to eat. You will not see that, of course.
But do you think we should see that?
Yes, I think you should. I think you should see it because if you're being asked to support a war, you should know what you're supporting. And the idea that war is basically about victory and defeat, I've said this before, is a lie. It is about death. It is about the total failure of the human spirit. And if you're going to be asked to support a war, you should know what you're supporting. And why shouldn't you see what I see? I don't mean you should be plastered with 24-hour corpses, but you should see how awful and obscene it is. And if you did, you wouldn't support the wars. And that's why today politicians who live by 24-hour television, Mr. Prime Minister, what's it going to be at 1 o'clock? The press conference at 12 will be out live at 1 o'clock. What's the theme for today? Watch the BBC, watch Sky News. We're deciding what these idiots say instead of them actually coming into touch with real news. And the problem is that there's not a single Western government administrator, minister today who has ever been in a war. You know, when I grew up, when you grew up, our leaders had been in wars. I mean, Dev was in 1916, Churchill in Britain was in the Battle of Omdurman, Eden was in the First World War, in the Second, Attlee. When I first went to Northern Ireland as a correspondent, William Whitelaw, Secretary of State, the first British Secretary of State, had been at the crossing of the Rhine in 1925. But now the only people who know about wars are the people who are in it, and the journalists, and that's why the politicians hate us.
But still, there is an issue here, and it's there was a photograph used in one of the Belfast Sunday papers, I think, just last Sunday, of an individual who had committed suicide.
Yes.
Okay. There are issues around what's permissible to use. And then sometimes people would say, well, it's because we don't know the name of that particular person who has died, or the name wouldn't mean anything, and we don't know the name anyway. But still, is it an intrusion? Is it an abuse? So I think
these are two different things. I know the picture, I've had a look at it. I thought that was preposterous. I mean, what was the picture meant to be saying? Suicide is good or suicide is bad? You know, it's ridiculous. It was purely sensational. But the point of showing the victims of war is that you are asked to support the institution which causes these people to be dead. That's a quite different issue altogether. I think you should see, not in a pornographic way, but you should see what's happening, and you don't. I mean, I had a very good example, I've recalled this before, in 2003 when the Americans invaded Iraq. A camera crew from Al Jazeera came back from Basra. I tried to get down, I got halfway and I was too frightened to write, there were so many bombs going off. But this crew got back with film from hospitals in Basra of the victims of British shell fire. It was the British who were besieging Basra, not the Americans. And there were children coming in with terrible wounds, with stomachs blown open, intestines hanging out, screaming and shrieking, and women coming in dead as well as alive. And pictures were horrifying, and they started putting them, you know, in a war you have this syndication system where everyone feeds their pictures through the various agencies, and they were sending this down the line via satellite to Reuters. And I knew them because they were actually Lebanese members of the Al Jazeera crew, and they invited me to watch the film as they sent it. And a voice came down from London, a very haughty voice. You know, there's not much point in showing us any more of this. We can't show this tea-time television. And crew said, look, please, we've risked our lives for these pictures. I know they're terrible, but people should see this, you know, it's true. This is what's happening in Basra under British shell fire. And they showed more pictures of the same, and the voice came back again and said, this is a kind of pornography, we can't show this. This is your program. And then they pleaded, look, we risked our lives for this film, please, just try and use a few images from this. And they went on showing, and the guy said, you know, we can't show this because we have to respect the dead. We don't respect them when they're alive, and we don't respect them when we blow them to pieces, but when they're dead, we can't show the film because we respect them so much. And this is the way in which television is lethal, because by cleaning war, it makes it more acceptable for you to accept it, and for politicians to get you to accept a just war, preventative war, humanitarian war, whatever you like. That is the danger. The technology is all there. You can see it in Saving Private Ryan. If you go to the cinema, you can almost see what we see. But on real television, where you have real cameras and a real war, you won't see what we see.
In other ways, compare the Falklands War, which was, I'm sure many people here will remember.
Oh, that awful man who kept saying
from the Minister of Information. And he was at sort of dictation speed as he gave the, I think he was trying to kill all interest in the war in some way. But I've forgotten his name now, but it was absolutely extraordinary stuff.
Worthily, I've forgotten.
Yeah. But of course, it was impossible to get cameras in there, impossible to get film back out of the Falklands, except with the cooperation.
Yes, the journalists were hostages there. But in Iraq, we were not hostages. but we didn't need to because at the end of the day, the television companies wouldn't show the film. There was a classic case, I remember, where I went down, I think the town was Hilla, and it was under air attack, or cluster bombs bursting, and one man ran up into the front of the hospital where I was interviewing a doctor, and he held in his arms his daughter, a young, very pretty young woman with her hair falling behind her, and her legs were protruding from the bottom of her trousers, and they were just bones, there was no feet. She was dead, obviously, you can't survive an amputation or anything like that. And a number of photographers came around and started taking pictures. And I wrote about it in the Independent next day, this terrible scene. And in every newspaper, of course when you come back from war, you go through all the papers to see what you missed, or rather what they missed. And there were constant pictures. We saw that this image was there. And the caption said, "A father brings his wounded daughter to hospital." I was wounded, she was dead, I saw her. But the picture had been cropped just above where her jeans ended, so you didn't see the bones sticking out the bottom. They brought her back to life because to say she was dead was too awful for the readers. And to show the fact that she was dead, because you could see human bones sticking out the bottom, that was too much. So they brought her back to life for newspaper readers. On every newspaper I found, she was brought back to life. And that's an example of the lie of cameras and the lie of journalists, and particularly the lie of the picture editors in London and New York. They did that. Be sure the photograph was sent in full.
Do you think it was correct to show the execution of Saddam Hussein on television?
Well, the execution was not shown on television. The actual execution was shown on recorded. You know,
the camera phone had sound, but there was film of the execution, official film of the execution. Wasn't it to show that he was dead?
It's interesting you're asking whether it was right to show Saddam's execution, but you haven't asked whether it was right to show the execution of Ceausescu and his wife.
I may come to that, because both of these occasions actually, these two men died with quite some dignity.
Yes, they did. And that's one reason why I think they objected, the powers that they objected to the pictures of Saddam. Had he been a gibbering wreck, it would have been.
Yeah, but I'm actually trying to ask you, Robert, about a question about viewers and so on. I take your point, and it's your views we're looking for. But to see somebody actually just dying on television, it isn't an easy question to just say, it must be shown, or we must see.
John, you're coming into this from the wrong end. Why do we show Saddam being hanging, but we do not see the innocent dying? That's the point, you see. I mean, if I ask in this audience, or you do now, and there may well be one or two people who put their hand up, apart from Saddam, whose name we know, is there anyone in this room who can put their hand up? I could probably, one or two other maybe. Is there anyone here who can put their hand up and knows one single name of an Iraqi who has been killed since 2003?
Mahamusa.
Well, yes, because he's famous, because I got his father and broke that story that the British had murdered him, which is the truth. British soldiers murdered him in prison. But anybody here, apart from Baba Musa, who's becoming a famous and infamous name for the British, any hands up of anybody who knows an Iraqi? That's the problem, John. We do not see the innocent die. We watch Saddam die because he's become a rogue, a hate figure. He's no longer real, you see. The man
if you were a news editor, how would you handle that footage as it came in?
If I was a news editor, I would have shown lots of dead people already, John. It would be quite normal to show that execution, yes. Right.
And then,
but showing it on its own told you more about yourself than it did about Saddam, you see. Yeah. Because you kept the innocent deaths out. Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah.
I'd just like to ask about, there has been some talk about the use of depleted uranium munitions in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And that's been described as covert nuclear war because, in fact, nuclear waste has been used as a component in munitions. And that makes it very effective munition, but it also has an extraordinary polluting effect on the atmosphere, particularly on the soil and so on. And as a result, there has been an enormous increase in cancers and in various sorts of mutations and so on. So it seems that there's been very, very little in the mass media about that.
Yes, I've noticed.
Would you like to comment about it?
Yes. I'm actually going to Iraq and Afghanistan in January and February on this particular assignment. I mean, I'm putting myself in this assignment. I spent months after the 1991 Gulf War in southern Iraq investigating the use of depleted uranium and the results. And there is not a shred of doubt in my mind that a vast contagion of cancers had spread across the Basra region, particularly down towards the areas where the big tank battles were fought. That depleted uranium is affecting particularly children, and they're all acquiring leukemias. And I'm sure it's now happening as a result of the 2003 war. There's no reason why it shouldn't. I found, for example, that in particular areas, many of the tank battles of the 1991 war were not fought in sand desert, they were fought in pasture areas where there were sheep, cattle, water. And in these areas there was an explosion of cancers among children. I went back repeatedly to talk to the children. In many cases they picked up bits of metal in the street and played with them. Perhaps I should explain that depleted uranium is the waste product of the nuclear industry, and used in munitions it gives a hardened head to tank shell, all rounds from the A-10, the sort of tank buster aircraft, another cliche of journalism, so that it allows it to penetrate armour in a way that other shells and bullets will not. It then flashes out with this kind of almost nuclear explosion inside a tank, for example, and burns, immediately burns to death all those inside. So it's not just a lethal weapon in its own right, it's also highly contaminated. Over and over again, I would go back to these cancer wards, children's cancer wards in Baghdad, and each time I went, all the children I photographed, and we put them all over the front page of the Independent, were all dead, and I would go back and meet a new lot and take pictures. And there was a little girl I remember, by chance there was a fan behind her head, it looked like she had a halo, a little baby, no hair of course. And one of the things we did, for example, we went in the Basra area out into the district which was most contaminated. And we found a man, a shepherd, walked up and said, "What are we doing?" I said, "Well, I'm interested in the tank battles that were here." He said, "Oh, yes." I said, any cancers in the family?" He said, "Yeah, my wife's just died and my daughter's in hospital. She's dying now of leukemia." "What?" "No history of cancer in the family." I mean, everyone in Iraq smokes 5,000 cigarettes a day, but not like this, not children. And then move forward, NATO used the same ammunition against the Serbs at a barracks called Hadici, just outside Sarajevo, in 1995. And afterwards, NATO cordoned off the area and then pointed out, well, there's nobody who's been contaminated, look, everyone's okay. Ignoring the fact that the Serbs had left that area because under the agreement for peace in Bosnia, they were moved over to the Drina Valley. So I raced in the snow over to the Drina Valley and found all these new graves in the local cemetery, and was taken immediately to see a little girl who was bleeding through her nose. She picked up and made a sandwich. You know, kids do this sort of thing with mud and bits of depleted uranium metal. She has since died. When I went back to Sarajevo, I wrote a huge report on this. I said, look, I've watched this contamination in Iraq. Now I'm watching it again in Bosnia, Serbian Bosnia as it was. And I put my telephone number and room number in my hotel in Sarajevo. I said, look, this place is packed with NATO medical staff, military medical staff. Just one of them, please, when you get this story, ring me, and I'll take you to this village on the Drina River, and you can see this little girl. Of course, nobody rang. They didn't want to see her, did they? And one occasion, we wanted, our readers put up $500,000 for medicine for the leukemia children in Baghdad, and the UN said they're going to block it. And we said, well, we're going to take it anyway, I'm going to bust it, I'm going to take it in. At which point they immediately gave permission, of course. And then, and one has to add this to the Department of Home Truths, Saddam blocked it. He didn't want, he wanted people to know that his people were dying of sanctions, UN sanctions. He didn't want people to know that he couldn't protect them from leukemias. We eventually did get, through a relative of Saddam, we got the medicines and I distributed them through CARE and through poor Margaret, who was later murdered, to all the various hospitals in Iraq. I didn't do any good, they all died. Every child died, without exception. That's all I can say.
So